The morning sky over Washington, D.C. was unusually bright, streaked with the soft oranges and pinks of dawn. At Reagan National Airport, Flight 227 was preparing for its journey across the country to Los Angeles. The tarmac buzzed with routine activity, ground crews moving luggage, the low hum of engines warming up, and flight attendants checking their stations with meticulous precision. Among them, Captain Daniel Reynolds performed his morning walk around, checking every inch of the aircraft. A seasoned pilot in his mid-40s, Reynolds had flown hundreds of domestic flights without incident, each day blending into the next. Today, however, as he looked up at the fuselage, he felt a subtle sense of unease. He couldn't explain, a flicker of premonition that he brushed off his nerves from the early hour. Passengers were beginning to board. Families hurried along the concourse, clinging to children's hands, while business travelers in tailored suits carried briefcases and laptops, heads buried in schedules and emails. The air carried the typical mixture of excitement, fatigue, and mild anxiety that accompanied domestic flights. Among the boarding passengers was Dr. Emily Carter, a trauma psychologist returning from a conference in D.C. She moved quietly, her demeanor calm, almost deliberate, as though she carried a steadying force that others unconsciously recognized. She navigated the aisle with her small rolling suitcase and laptop bag, settling into seat 14A by the window. Her eyes scanned the cabin, noting the arrangements, the passengers' expressions, and the flight attendants' movements. To anyone watching, she appeared to be a woman simply preparing for another flight, but inside, her mind was observant, calculating, and alert. The plane hummed as the engines roared to life. Captain Reynolds took his seat in the cockpit, running through the pre-flight checklists methodically. His co-pilot, a younger man named Mike Harris, joked about catching an early landing to tease him. Reynolds chuckled politely, but the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him as always. Flying a plane was a delicate dance between human skill and machine precision. Every decision, every adjustment, could ripple across the lives of the passengers on board. Reynolds's hands gripped the controls with quiet confidence, the morning light reflecting off his polished instrument panel. Outside, the city's monuments faded behind them as the plane lifted gracefully into the sky, leaving the bustling capital below. Inside the cabin, passengers settled in, unaware of the tension yet to come. Emily glanced around at the diverse faces around her. A young couple whispering, their hands intertwined. A retired man reading a dog-eared newspaper. A teenager immersed in music, earbuds in, oblivious to the world. A small child clutched a stuffed bear, eyes wide with curiosity and slight apprehension. Emily smiled softly at the child and offered a reassuring nod, a simple gesture that would later contrast sharply with the terror that was to unfold. She knew instinctively that human reactions often reveal more than words ever could, and she was quietly cataloging them all, though the passengers themselves had no idea. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the sun climbed higher, illuminating clouds that stretched like rivers of silk across the horizon. The hum of the engines was steady and hypnotic. Flight attendants moved along the aisles, offering drinks, snacks, and smiles, creating a sense of normalcy that comforted many passengers. Emily allowed herself a moment to breathe, closing her eyes and practicing a mental grounding exercise she often used during high-stress situations. In her mind, she revisited scenarios, mentally preparing for emergencies, not because she expected one, but because her profession demanded readiness. Trauma psychologists, after all, often anticipate human behavior under extreme stress, studying reactions, calculating probabilities, and preparing interventions even before danger strikes. Nearby, a group of men boarded and settled toward the back of the plane. Their movements were deliberate, yet something about them caught Emily's attention. Subtle exchanges of glances, a quiet tension in their posture. Most passengers didn't notice, distracted by their devices, conversations, or the view outside the window. Emily, however, observed with a trained eye. She noted the minor inconsistencies, the nervous tapping of a foot, the way one man scanned the cabin repeatedly. There was nothing overtly alarming yet, nothing that would cause the flight crew to act, but her instincts registered a faint undercurrent of unease, a whisper that something could go wrong. Captain Reynolds, meanwhile, monitored the flight instruments, occasionally checking the cabin camera feed. He noticed nothing unusual at first, just the usual mix of passengers and activity. Still, he often glanced at the feed, a habit born of experience and caution. He had been flying for over 20 years, and he knew that unexpected events often began subtly, almost imperceptibly. At this point, everything seemed routine, but Reynolds felt a shadow of apprehension that he could not explain, a sensation like the air before a storm, calm on the surface, yet charged with unseen energy. Emily's own thoughts drifted, reflecting on her recent conference. She had spent days discussing the psychological impact of mass trauma, resilience under pressure, and human behavior in crisis. Ironically, she now found herself in a mundane moment of peace before something extraordinary would challenge her in ways no conference could prepare for. She looked out the window at the clouds passing beneath, letting her mind wander briefly to the beauty of the sky, the endless expanse of blue that seemed impossibly distant, yet incredibly close. A sense of quiet purpose settled over her, a preparation she didn't fully understand, a readiness she could not yet name. The flight attendants continued their rounds, smiles professional, voices calm, adding an atmosphere of safety. Families laughed quietly, travelers worked on their laptops, and the plane hummed steadily along its path. For most, it was an ordinary morning, an ordinary flight, a small journey between cities. Yet in these ordinary moments, the extraordinary was about to emerge. Emily adjusted her seat, checked the overhead bin, and offered a polite nod to the flight attendant who passed by. Every small gesture reinforced her presence as a calm, collected individual, a stark contrast to the chaos that was silently approaching. No one could have anticipated what was about to occur, not even Captain Reynolds, despite his experience, or Emily, despite her expertise. The morning sky continued to gleam, peaceful and serene. And yet, within the controlled chaos of an airplane, cabin passengers, crew, luggage, metal, and fuel, a storm was forming. A storm that would test courage, calmness, and the limits of human resilience at 30,000 feet. 2 hours into the flight, the calm hum of the engines and the soft chatter of passengers suddenly shattered. From the back of the cabin, 3 men stood abruptly, their movements precise, almost rehearsed. The passengers froze, confusion rippling through the aisles as the men brandished small, sharp weapons. Panic erupted instantly. Screams, shouts, the clatter of luggage tumbling to the floor. A flight attendant froze mid-step, her tray falling with a sharp crash that made everyone flinch. "Everyone down, now!" One of the men barked in a rough accent, his eyes scanning the cabin with predatory precision. Captain Reynolds, sitting in the cockpit, felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the intercom crackled with static and muffled cries. The co-pilot, Mike Harris, fumbled with the controls, eyes wide with shock. Reynolds gritted his teeth and forced himself to remain calm, repeating the same mantra he always did in emergencies. Control what you can, anticipate what you cannot. Yet even his decades of experience could not fully prepare him for the sudden, palpable terror radiating from his passengers. Emily Carter, seated near the center of the cabin, remained remarkably composed. Her eyes darted between the hijackers and the passengers, silently analyzing every movement. She noted the tension in their shoulders, the subtle tremor in the youngest man's hands, the way the leader's eyes scanned for authority. She whispered softly to the child next to her, "It's okay. Stay calm." Breathe with me. The child's grip on his stuffed bear loosened slightly, a small victory in the mounting chaos. Emily's calmness was magnetic. A few nearby passengers instinctively mirrored her breathing, their fear momentarily subdued by her quiet presence. One of the hijackers lunged toward the first-class section, shouting at the flight attendants to kneel. The air inside the cabin was thick with fear and the acrid scent of adrenaline. A woman screamed, clutching her purse as if it were a lifeline. A businessman dropped his laptop, watching it slide across the aisle helplessly. Every instinct in Emily's body screamed to move, to flee, yet she stayed seated, calculating. She had studied situations like this extensively, not as a spectator, but as a professional who knew how micro-actions could influence outcomes in extreme crises. Every twitch, every glance, every tone of voice mattered. The lead hijacker, tall and imposing, barked orders with relentless force, waving a pistol. Move to the back, now. His voice echoed through the cabin, sharp and commanding. Most passengers obeyed, fear-stricken and trembling. A mother scooped her crying toddler into her arms, kneeling on the floor as instructed. Emily, observing carefully, made sure she stayed in plain sight, but kept a mental distance from the armed men. She knew that appearing submissive could prevent immediate aggression, but total inaction could reduce her influence later. Captain Reynolds tried to communicate over the cockpit radio, but received only static and partial responses. His heart pounded in rhythm with the engines as he kept the plane steady. He realized that any sudden maneuver could provoke the hijackers, potentially endangering everyone aboard. With every second, the stakes grew higher. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he glanced at the cabin monitor, catching sight of Emily for the first time. Even in this chaos, she was calm, her posture upright, her gaze alert, her voice soft yet commanding in snippets of reassurance to those near her. Reynolds's mind raced. Who is this woman? He wondered. And what is she planning? As the hijackers herded passengers to the rear, Emily subtly observed their hierarchy. The youngest man, no older than 20, was visibly shaking, his gun clutched too tightly. The leader barked orders, seemingly frustrated at the lack of compliance from his junior accomplice. Emily recognized the opportunity, divide and conquer the hijackers' cohesion. She whispered quietly to the nearest passenger, "Stay still. Watch them. Notice everything." Her tone was calm but urgent, conveying control. The passengers nearest her absorbed her quiet authority, their terror momentarily tempered by her unspoken leadership. Meanwhile, the hijackers began to inspect luggage compartments, removing items with practiced swiftness. One man, impatient and reckless, slammed the trolley into a row of seats. The sound was deafening, punctuated by terrified gasps. Emily's eyes followed every movement, noting patterns, gestures, and micro-expressions. She recognized the smallest hints of hesitation, the quick glance away from the leader, the uncertain footstep. These details mattered. In moments like these, when lives hung in balance, understanding human behavior could mean the difference between chaos and survival. Passengers screamed and cried, some huddling with arms wrapped around children or spouses. One elderly man clutched his rosary, muttering prayers under his breath. Emily's voice, steady and measured, cut through the cacophony. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. "We need to stay calm. Follow my lead." A young woman near her nodded, gripping the armrest tightly but visibly steadier. Emily's subtle influence was growing, a ripple of composure in this storm of fear. The lead hijacker noticed the woman's calmness and glared at her briefly. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The leader's eyes narrowed, suspicion mingling with frustration. Emily did not flinch. She met his gaze briefly, then shifted her attention back to the passengers, subtly reassuring them with nods and gestures. Her behavior was deliberate, She projected confidence without challenging authority, a delicate balance between defiance and submission. Captain Reynolds, watching her on the cockpit monitor, realized that this woman might be more than just calm. She might be a key factor in controlling the unfolding chaos. As minutes dragged on, the hijacker's tension grew. The youngest member's hands trembled visibly, and he glanced repeatedly at Emily, almost instinctively seeking reassurance or confirmation. The leader, frustrated by the slow compliance of his group and the unexpected calmness of the woman near the center, barked sharper commands. Emily noted the escalation and prepared herself to act, but carefully. She understood that any misstep could trigger violence. Her mind raced through potential interventions, subtle signals, and methods to influence the hijackers without exposing herself or the passengers to immediate danger. The passengers, meanwhile, began to realize that something extraordinary was happening in the center of the cabin. A wave of cautious hope rippled through those near Emily. Her calm composure was infectious. People instinctively slowed their breathing, their trembling hands steadied slightly, their minds focusing on survival rather than panic. It was a small, fragile shift, but in a crisis measured in seconds, even the smallest shift could have monumental consequences. Outside the plane, the sky remained calm, serene, and oblivious to the unfolding terror below. Inside, Flight 227 had transformed from a routine domestic trip into a high-stakes crucible of fear, courage, and human behavior. Emily Carter had positioned herself, not in defiance, but as an anchor, a stabilizing presence in the storm. Captain Reynolds, monitoring from the cockpit, felt a surge of hope. Among the chaos, there was someone whose actions might shape the outcome in ways he could barely predict. Minutes stretched like hours as the hijackers continued their inspection, shouting, gesturing, and occasionally hitting seats. Passengers whispered prayers, clutched loved ones, and tried to remain unseen. Emily, still composed, allowed herself to assess not just the hijackers, but the passengers, their strengths, vulnerabilities, and potential allies in an unfolding crisis. Every observation was critical. Every decision could influence the chain of events that would determine who survived and who did not. And so, the ordinary flight transformed into a crucible of extraordinary courage. The calm woman in seat 14A, quietly observing, guiding, and preparing, became a silent force within the chaos. The hijackers did not yet understand the subtle influence she wielded, but Captain Reynolds, watching through the cockpit monitor, recognized it immediately. The flight was no longer just about survival. It was about strategy, courage, and the quiet, almost invisible power of a single human mind under pressure. Captain Daniel Reynolds' hands gripped the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. From the cockpit, he could hear the muffled screams and shouting through the static-laden intercom. The chaos in the cabin was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. His co-pilot, Mike Harris, sat frozen, pale as the morning sunlight streaming through the cockpit windows, gripping his checklist like a lifeline. Reynolds swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus on the plane, the instruments, and the tiny fragment of control still left in his hands. One wrong move, one sudden jolt, and the entire flight could descend into catastrophe. Yet amid the storm of panic, Reynolds caught sight of something unusual on the cabin monitor. A woman in seat 14A, Emily Carter, remained composed. She wasn't huddled with fear. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't even visibly anxious. She was calm, her posture upright, her gaze deliberate, her voice soft yet commanding as she whispered to passengers near her. The contrast was so stark, it almost seemed unreal. While everyone else trembled, sobbed, or cried out in terror, she moved with quiet confidence, guiding and comforting without drawing attention to herself. Reynolds blinked, unsure whether he was seeing courage or defiance or both. The cockpit filled with the low hum of engines and the higher pitch of tension. Reynolds monitored the hijacker's movements on the camera feed. The lead hijacker barked orders, waving his weapon, while the youngest member of the trio trembled visibly, glancing repeatedly at Emily. His hesitation was small but significant, almost imperceptible to anyone without a trained eye, but Reynolds noticed it immediately. It was as if Emily's calm radiated outward, subtly influencing the behavior of the hijackers themselves. Reynolds's pulse quickened. Could she be manipulating them without them even realizing it? Inside the cabin, Emily's presence became an anchor for the passengers. A young mother clutched her infant, listening to Emily's whispered instructions. Hold him close. Breathe with me. We're going to stay calm. It's okay. A teenager, headphones dangling around his neck, mimicked her slow breathing. Even the elderly man clutching his rosary glanced at her, nodding slightly, as though her composure offered him some fragile shield against the chaos. Reynolds felt a surge of hope as he observed these subtle ripples. He realized that this woman might be the single most important person aboard the aircraft at that moment. Emily's mind worked at a relentless pace. She cataloged the hijackers' hierarchy, their weaknesses, and their movements. The lead was dominant and aggressive, clearly experienced in intimidation, but overconfident. The youngest was hesitant, uncertain, almost susceptible to influence. The third man remained stoic, observing both the leader and the passengers, but showed no initiative. Emily assessed the dynamics, identifying the fractures and vulnerabilities she could exploit. Her professional experience in crisis psychology became a quiet weapon in the fight for survival. The hijackers began to notice her. The lead's gaze flicked toward her briefly, suspicion flashing in his eyes, but he was too absorbed in controlling the others to confront her directly. Emily remained in plain sight, calm but alert, her every movement deliberate. She whispered instructions to nearby passengers: how to stay low, how to remain silent, how to make themselves less threatening. Each small act of guidance helped maintain order and prevent panic from spreading, and Reynolds watched in awe. The cockpit monitor captured every subtle interaction: the tilt of a head, the steadying of a trembling hand, the quiet confidence of a single human being against three armed men. Reynolds spoke quietly to Mike, his voice tense but measured. Look at her. Do you see what she's doing? Mike squinted at the monitor, then shook his head. She's calm. She's like she's controlling the room without anyone noticing. Reynolds nodded. Exactly. If she can maintain this composure, it might just give us a chance to regain control. He adjusted the autopilot slightly to stabilize the aircraft, careful not to provoke the hijackers with sudden turbulence. Every second counted, and every observation mattered. Emily moved through the cabin with calculated care. She knelt beside a passenger who had fainted, checking for breathing, reassuring them without alarming the hijackers. She offered a water bottle to another passenger, not just as a gesture of comfort, but as a subtle method of establishing trust. Her influence was growing, almost imperceptibly, until even the youngest hijacker seemed to pause, torn between obedience and hesitation. Reynolds could see it clearly on the monitor. Emily was planting seeds of doubt, subtly destabilizing the fragile unity among the hijackers, all while keeping herself and others safe. The lead hijacker barked sharply, pointing his weapon at a passenger who had dared to look up. Sit down, now, he roared. Emily complied visibly, but did so with measured calm, her hands resting gently in her lap. She maintained eye contact with nearby passengers, silently signaling them to stay calm, to trust her guidance. Reynolds's eyes narrowed. He realized that her actions were deliberate. She was not merely surviving. She was influencing the situation, shaping it in real time with a precision that left him stunned. Time became elastic. Minutes felt like hours as the plane cruised above the clouds, and the cabin became a theater of fear, courage, and subtle strategy. Emily whispered to a small group of passengers, "Stay quiet. Observe them. Notice their weaknesses. We can make it through this." Her calmness was contagious, providing a fragile thread of control amidst the chaos. Reynolds leaned forward, speaking softly into the radio to air traffic control, trying to mask his urgency while noting every detail that Emily's presence highlighted. The hijackers, for their part, began to show cracks in their composure. The youngest member's eyes darted repeatedly to Emily, seeking cues, reassurance, or instruction. The lead appeared frustrated by the lack of immediate chaos among the passengers. Subtle tension crept into their movements, the slightest pause, the fraction of hesitation that could prove pivotal. Reynolds watched, heart pounding, as he realized that survival no longer depended solely on skillful piloting. It depended on the psychological battle unfolding in the cabin, led quietly by one woman. Emily's mind was sharp, calculating every potential outcome. She began planning her next moves, subtle interventions, potential distractions, and coded ways to communicate with the cockpit. She knew that the slightest misstep could trigger violence, yet she also recognized that maintaining calm, controlling fear, and influencing decisions could save lives. Each whispered word, each small gesture, each calculated glance was a deliberate act of courage. Reynolds, observing her, understood something vital. In this crisis, courage did not roar. It whispered, it guided, it anchored. Outside, the sky remained tranquil, mocking the chaos inside. Sunlight glinted off the wings of Flight 227, creating an illusion of serenity as the plane hurtled through the air. Inside, the cabin had become a microcosm of tension, hope, and human resilience. Emily Carter remained the epicenter of calm, her presence radiating a subtle but undeniable influence over passengers and hijackers alike. Reynolds knew that the outcome of this flight might very well depend on her actions in the next crucial minutes. And so, in the cockpit and in the cabin, a quiet battle unfolded, one of fear and domination, one of calm and subtle strategy. Reynolds' eyes never left the monitor, watching Emily guide, reassure, and influence the terrified passengers. He realized that at this precise moment, the fate of Flight 227 rested not just on his skill, but on the courage and composure of the woman who had become the unlikeliest hero in a sky filled with uncertainty. The cabin of Flight 227 was a world transformed. Just minutes ago, ordinary passengers had been chatting, sipping coffee, or scrolling through their phones. Now, fear hung thick in the air like smoke. Shouts from the hijackers reverberated off the metal walls, punctuated by the occasional crash of a fallen bag or overturned tray. The youngest hijacker's hands trembled with every command from his leader. Captain Reynolds in the cockpit gritted his teeth, gripping the controls as he watched the unfolding tension on the monitor. But amid the chaos, one person remained a beacon of calm: Emily Carter. Emily observed the hijacker's every movement with meticulous attention. She noticed the smallest details, the slight hesitation in the youngest member's step, the rigid posture of the lead, the stoic indifference of the third man. Her eyes flicked between the passengers and the hijackers, silently mapping vulnerabilities, evaluating potential interventions, and anticipating reactions. She spoke quietly to those around her, her voice low and measured. Keep your hands visible, breathe slowly, stay calm. Watch them. Notice everything. Small movements, subtle cues, they matter. Her instructions were simple, but grounded in deep understanding of human psychology. The passengers nearest her began to respond. A young woman who had been shaking uncontrollably took Emily's advice, placing her hands flat on the floor, inhaling and exhaling with deliberate slowness. A father clutched his child tightly, following Emily's subtle guidance, and the child stopped crying, eyes wide but calm. Even the elderly man with the rosary visibly steadied himself, nodding slightly at Emily's whispered reassurance. Small ripples of composure began spreading through the cabin, subtle yet noticeable. Emily's calm presence was influencing behavior, reducing panic even under the looming threat of armed hijackers. Meanwhile, the youngest hijacker struggled to maintain control. His gaze kept drifting toward Emily. She had not directly confronted him, had not made a single threatening move, yet he seemed unsettled by her calmness. The lead noticed and barked sharper orders, slamming his hand against the seatback in frustration. Emily's mind raced. She understood that in a high-stakes crisis, hesitation could be exploited, not recklessly, but strategically. The youngest man's uncertainty was her opening, the first thread in a chain that could unravel the hijacker's cohesion. Emily moved deliberately, kneeling beside a passenger who had fainted during the initial rush of fear. She checked for breathing, her movements professional and composed. She whispered, "You're okay. Just stay calm. We're going to get through this." The passenger stirred slightly, encouraged by her presence. Every motion, every word, was calculated to stabilize the environment without provoking the hijackers. She knew that any visible panic could trigger violence. Her actions were a blend of reassurance and strategy, a delicate balance of empathy and control. The hijackers began to notice her calm demeanor. The lead's eyes narrowed as he observed her interacting with other passengers. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered, frustrated by her composure. The youngest member's trembling hands wavered, and he glanced at her again, conflicted between following orders and his growing doubt. Emily recognized the dynamic immediately. She could not confront the leader directly, that would provoke aggression, but she could guide the hesitant one, subtly shaping decisions without appearing threatening. Reynolds watched the unfolding dynamic in awe. Emily whispered again to the nearest passengers, "Watch them. Notice the tension. Stay quiet. If we move carefully, we can control our own reactions and influence theirs." Her voice, soft and steady, became a lifeline. The passengers absorbed her instructions, feeling a fragile sense of hope in a moment otherwise dominated by fear. Some copied her breathing, some followed her subtle gestures, and slowly the cabin's chaos became slightly more manageable. Emily had created pockets of calm in a storm, a ripple effect that even the hijackers began to notice. She shifted her focus back to the youngest hijacker. He flinched as the leader shouted, as she subtly made eye contact with him, a quiet, reassuring acknowledgement that did not challenge authority, but created connection. She saw hesitation in his expression, fear mixed with doubt. Emily recognized the critical moment. A single word of guidance, a small nudge, could influence his next decision. She whispered quietly to a passenger near him, encouraging minimal movement, ensuring their compliance without drawing attention. Her subtle orchestration began to shape the cabin's environment, establishing a fragile balance between control and chaos. Meanwhile, Reynolds monitored every detail from the cockpit. He adjusted altitude slightly, avoiding turbulence that might trigger panic. He glanced at the monitor, captivated by Emily's subtle maneuvers. She was influencing the cabin, shaping the behavior of both passengers and hijackers without leaving the safety of her seat. Reynolds' mind raced. This woman wasn't merely surviving. She was leading in the most extraordinary circumstances imaginable. Every second she remained calm. Every word she whispered, every gesture she made, increased the chances of survival for everyone aboard. Flight 227. Emily noticed a subtle exchange between the hijackers. The lead was frustrated, barking at the youngest, who faltered, unsure of his actions. The stoic third man remained silent, watching closely. Emily recognized the potential fracture in their unity. She could not force a confrontation, but she could encourage hesitation, seed doubt, and maintain calm among the passengers. until the opportunity presented itself. She whispered once more, "Stay aware. Watch them carefully. Your calm is our strength. Trust it." Her words were simple, but in the charged atmosphere, they carried extraordinary weight. A scream erupted as a passenger accidentally bumped into the leader. He swung his weapon, shouting furiously. Emily's body remained steady, her hands relaxed in her lap. She stepped forward slightly, offering reassurance to the frightened passenger. "It's okay," she said, her tone gentle but firm. The leader's attention was momentarily distracted by the passenger's compliance and her calm demeanor. Reynolds noticed the shift immediately, the tiniest fracture in the hijacker's cohesion. Emily had created influence without direct confrontation, a subtle victory that could determine life or death in the moments to come. Minutes stretched endlessly, the hum of the engines masking the intense psychological battle unfolding within the cabin. Emily's presence was magnetic, a center of calm around which the passengers gravitated. The youngest hijacker continued to hesitate, glancing repeatedly at her, uncertain and conflicted. Reynolds' pulse quickened. He realized that survival no longer depended solely on his skill in the cockpit. It depended on Emily's quiet leadership and strategic calm. Each second she maintained composure increased the odds of preserving life. Emily subtly moved through the cabin, maintaining eye contact with passengers, whispering guidance, assessing reactions. She reinforced calmness, subtly influenced the hesitant hijacker, and watched the leader's frustration grow. Her expertise in human behavior had transformed an ordinary flight into a battleground of psychology, strategy, and courage. The cabin, though still tense, had pockets of control, ripples of composure that might just tip the balance. Reynolds leaned forward, gripping the yoke, silently praying that her interventions would continue to hold. Outside, the sky remained serene, mocking the turmoil below. Sunlight glinted off the wings as the aircraft cruised steadily, unaware of the life and death decisions unfolding within. Emily Carter, seated calmly amidst terrified passengers, continued her quiet work observing, guiding, influencing, and preparing. Every whispered word, every subtle gesture, every calculated breath contributed to a fragile equilibrium, the balance between chaos and control. Reynolds understood it now. The fate of Flight 227 rested not just on skill or luck, but on the extraordinary composure of a single remarkable woman. The cabin of Flight 227 remained a tense, trembling microcosm of fear. Passengers huddled together, eyes wide, breath shallow, while the hijacker's sharp commands echoed off the metal walls. The lead man's frustration was visible in every tense muscle of his body, and the youngest member's uncertainty grew by the second. Amid this chaos, Emily Carter remained calm, a steadying presence that few noticed, yet everyone relied upon. She had observed every movement, every glance, every small tick of the hijackers, and she had begun to formulate a plan, a subtle, calculated intervention that could shift the balance of control. Emily's mind raced. She recalled the emergency procedures she had learned for cockpit communications and in-flight systems, combined with her knowledge of human behavior under stress. Her eyes flicked to the service panel near the galley phone. In normal circumstances, it was an ordinary fixture, housing communications tools meant for crew emergencies. But in the current situation, it was potentially a lifeline. She waited for a moment when the hijacker's attention was drawn elsewhere, brief clash of voices and gesturing, and leaned slightly forward, pretending to search for water in the galley cart. Every movement was deliberate. She crouched low, opening the panel just enough to access the communication buttons inside. The youngest hijacker was pacing nearby, weapon clenched, but hands trembling. Emily's heart raced, but her face remained serene. She pressed the buttons, carefully manipulating the system, recalling instructions she had observed earlier. The cockpit intercom crackled softly, almost imperceptibly, a connection made without alerting the hijackers. A single coded signal was sent, brief but vital. 3 men. 1 hesitant. Weapons small. Captain Reynolds, monitoring the cabin and the instruments, caught the faint signal immediately. His pulse quickened as he realized what had just occurred. He whispered to Mike Harris, "She's doing it. She's helping us." The cockpit remained silent, the 2 men listening intently as Emily continued her quiet orchestration. The importance of her actions could not be overstated. By providing even this small bit of intelligence, she had transformed from a passive observer into a critical element of the survival strategy, giving the pilot actionable insight into the hijackers' numbers, positions, and behavior. Meanwhile, Emily returned to her seat, maintaining her calm composure. She adjusted a blanket over a nearby child, whispered soothing words to frightened passengers, and subtly guided them to stay still. Her movements were small, almost invisible, but they carried extraordinary influence. The youngest hijacker glanced at her once, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Emily noted it, but did not react overtly. Timing was critical. Any overt movement could provoke violence. She had to balance invisibility with impact, subtlety with decisive action. The passengers nearest Emily began to follow her cues. Breathing slowed, trembling hands steadied, eyes that had darted in panic now focused on her gentle guidance. She whispered instructions. "Stay low, hands visible. Follow my lead. Watch them, but do not move unless I signal." A ripple of composure began to spread, soft but unmistakable. Reynolds watched in awe from the cockpit. The passengers were responding to Emily's quiet influence, and the youngest hijacker's hesitation continued to grow. He was beginning to question, even if fleetingly, the authority of his leader. The lead hijacker, frustrated by the lack of immediate chaos, barked sharper orders, slamming his hand against a seatback. Emily, seated and composed, did not flinch. She made subtle eye contact with the hesitant hijacker, a quiet acknowledgement that conveyed control without threatening authority. She saw the brief flash of doubt in his eyes, the first real crack in their cohesion. Reynolds's mind raced. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for, a fragile opening that could turn the tide in their favor. Emily's strategy was methodical. She continued her calm, whispering to nearby passengers, guiding them to maintain composure while subtly monitoring the hijackers. Every movement was calculated to preserve safety and influence behavior without triggering aggression. She noticed that the leader's voice had begun to rise, frustration edging toward anger, while the youngest hijacker's gun wavered slightly in his grip. The 3rd man remained stoic, watching closely but not intervening. Emily assessed the delicate hierarchy, identifying fractures and planning her next subtle interventions. She leaned slightly toward the passenger next to her, speaking in a low voice. "Notice their tension. It's growing. They are not as solid as they seem. Small movements, careful observation, and calm reactions, this is our strength." The passenger nodded, gripping their armrest with renewed steadiness. Emily's quiet instructions provided psychological armor, creating a pocket of composure amidst the chaos. Reynolds, watching the monitors, recognized the critical importance of her influence. She was shaping the environment, maintaining control over panic, and preparing to exploit the hijackers' vulnerabilities. The youngest hijacker's hesitation became more pronounced. He glanced repeatedly at Emily, unsure of his next move. The leader's authority was being subtly challenged, not by confrontation, but by observation, doubt, and calm defiance. Emily had created a psychological anchor, a presence that altered the balance of power. Reynolds leaned closer to the controls, aware that every second of hesitation could provide the cockpit with opportunities to act, to regain partial control, and potentially save the lives of all aboard. Emily's mind remained focused, calculating her next moves. She observed the leader pacing back and forth, the youngest struggling to maintain posture and weapon control, and the third man silently watching. She could not act recklessly. A single misstep could trigger violence. But she could continue to influence, guide, and prepare for a larger intervention. Every whisper, every gesture, every quiet command to passengers was part of a meticulous plan to stabilize the cabin, shape behavior, and prepare for decisive action. Minutes passed, the hum of the engines a constant reminder of the peril above the clouds. The cabin remained tense, but Emily's subtle guidance was working. The youngest hijacker's hands trembled visibly, his gaze shifting toward her once more. The lead's frustration escalated, evident in his sharp words and rapid gestures. Emily continued to whisper to the passengers, encouraging calmness, maintaining composure, and observing every subtle movement. Her quiet presence was beginning to fracture the hijacker's unity, one hesitant moment at a time. Reynolds realized that survival depended not just on his piloting skill, but on Emily's actions in the cabin. Her calmness, intelligence, and strategic influence had created a fragile but crucial advantage. He began to formulate a plan in his mind, coordinating with air traffic control, while observing the subtle shifts in the hijacker's behavior. Emily's coded signal had provided critical information, but her ongoing influence could determine whether that intelligence could be acted upon safely. As the plane cruised through the high-altitude sky, Emily remained composed, whispering, guiding, observing, and preparing. She had become the pivot point of the crisis, her calm presence influencing passengers, creating hesitation in the hijackers, and providing actionable intelligence to the cockpit. The situation remained perilous, but for the first time since the hijacking began, there was a glimmer of hope. The aircraft was not just a vessel of terror. It had become a stage for courage, strategy, and extraordinary human resilience. Outside, the sky remained serene, oblivious to the drama unfolding within. Inside, Flight 227 had transformed into a complex theater of fear, psychology, and calculated intervention. Emily Carter, seated quietly yet commanding attention with her presence, continued to orchestrate subtle actions that could tip the scales of survival. Reynolds knew that the next crucial moments would determine the fate of everyone on board, and that her calm, intelligent, and strategic approach might just save them all. The cabin of Flight 227 had become a delicate battlefield of tension, fear, and subtle influence. Minutes stretched like hours, the passengers frozen between terror and the faint glimmers of hope Emily had begun to instill. The lead hijacker's voice rose repeatedly, sharp and commanding, but cracks were appearing in the youngest member's composure. He hesitated before repeating orders, glanced toward Emily again, and adjusted his trembling grip on the small firearm in his hands. Each hesitation was a victory that no one but Emily in the cockpit could truly recognize, yet it shifted the balance of control in this airborne crucible. Emily's eyes moved rapidly across the cabin. Her voice remained quiet but firm, whispering guidance to passengers near her. Keep your heads low. Move slowly if needed. Stay calm and follow my lead. A woman clutched her child tightly, following Emily's breathing cues. A young man seated across the aisle mimicked her hand movements, flattening himself against the seat and calming his tremors. Even the elderly man with the rosary seemed steadier, muttering a prayer under his breath with measured breaths, guided by Emily's subtle influence. The small ripples of calm were growing, and she could sense that the hesitant hijacker was noticing. The youngest hijacker's hesitation reached a critical point. His eyes flicked repeatedly to Emily, searching subconsciously for assurance or guidance. He had been trained to obey, but her calmness, her lack of fear, and her quiet authority planted seeds of doubt. Emily recognized the moment for a subtle psychological nudge. She whispered to the passengers, carefully maintaining eye contact and ensuring no sudden movement would provoke the lead hijacker. Watch them. Notice their cracks. Stay silent. This is the moment to stay composed. Her words were measured but powerful, and they created an invisible network of compliance and awareness throughout the cabin. The lead hijacker barked again, slamming a weapon against the seat back in frustration. "Do as I say." "Now," he shouted. But the youngest member paused, indecision flashing across his face. Emily's heart pounded, but she remained serene, projecting control through posture, gaze, and subtle movements. She understood the psychology at play. Fear and aggression could fracture under calm influence. The hesitant hijacker's hesitation was becoming decisive. Reynolds in the cockpit noticed the change immediately. For the first time since the hijacking began, the dynamics were shifting, not because of force, but because of calculated calm. Emily whispered again to the passengers nearest her, her words barely audible above the low hum of the engines and distant shouts. "Stay steady. Follow my lead. Watch carefully, but do not react unless I signal. Our calm is our shield." Passengers adjusted instinctively. Hands flattened on the floor, bodies crouched, eyes alert but not panicked. Emily's subtle orchestration had created a quiet unity, a ripple effect of composure that contrasted with the hijacker's growing frustration. The lead's aggression was met with hesitation instead of compliance, slowly destabilizing the power he relied upon to control the cabin. Then came the critical opening. A youngest hijacker, trembling, glanced at Emily and flinched at a whispered sound from one of the passengers following her cues. His weapon wavered, and his eyes darted toward the lead, seeking validation. The leader barked, frustration igniting, but Emily's calm gaze remained fixed, unwavering. She had achieved the delicate balance: influence without confrontation, control without aggression. The hijacker's cohesion was fracturing. A subtle but pivotal psychological shift had occurred, and the possibility of regaining control began to crystallize in her mind. Emily leaned slightly toward the hesitant hijacker without making a threatening move. Her movement was minimal, almost imperceptible, but it communicated quiet authority and awareness. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice carrying calm strength. "Think about what you're doing. You don't have to hurt anyone. There's a choice." The words were gentle but precise, reaching the youngest member without provoking the lead. His hands trembled further, his posture slackened slightly, and for a fleeting moment, doubt eclipsed obedience. Reynolds, observing on the cockpit monitor, realized the moment was critical. Emily had planted a seed of hesitation that could lead to decisive action. Suddenly, a scuffle erupted near the rear of the cabin. A passenger had attempted to subtly block a movement from one of the hijackers, emboldened by Emily's guidance. The lead swung his weapon, yelling, but the third hijacker hesitated, uncertain how to react. Emily remained composed, whispering instructions to nearby passengers. "Stay low. Don't move unless I tell you. Keep calm. We're going to get through this." The passengers followed her lead meticulously, each action reinforcing the fragile control Emily had established. Reynolds' hands tightened around the yoke as he watched the psychological chessboard play out below him. Emily recognized the pattern immediately. Hesitation, doubt, and minor rebellion could be leveraged to regain momentum. She began to give subtle cues to the hesitant hijacker, guiding him psychologically toward inaction rather than aggression. Her words were soft, her tone unthreatening, yet firm. "You can choose differently," she whispered again. "No one will know if you pause. Think carefully. Stay calm." The young man's grip on the weapon loosened slightly, his breathing shallow, his movements increasingly erratic. Emily had identified the fracture in the hijacker's chain of command, and she prepared to exploit it strategically. Captain Reynolds in the cockpit adjusted the plane slightly, maintaining altitude and stability while avoiding turbulence that could provoke the hijackers. He observed Emily's maneuvers and the passenger reactions, realizing that survival now depended as much on human psychology as piloting skill. Each second of calm influence created by Emily increased the odds of turning the hijacking in their favor. The passengers, sensing the subtle shift, clung to her guidance, their fear restrained just enough to allow potential action without triggering violence. Minutes dragged on, but Emily's quiet orchestration continued. She whispered instructions, maintained composure, and assessed reactions, while the youngest hijacker's hesitation became more pronounced. The lead grew frustrated, pacing, shouting, gesturing aggressively. The third man remained silent, observing but unwilling to intervene decisively. Emily had created the perfect conditions for a turning point, a break in the hijacker's cohesion that could be exploited when the moment was right. Finally, the opportunity presented itself. The lead hijacker barked another order, waving his weapon threateningly at a passenger who had accidentally made a small movement. The youngest hesitated, glancing toward Emily. At that precise moment, a small group of passengers, subtly guided by her, froze and held still, their calm and deliberate obedience creating confusion and hesitation among the hijackers. The psychological balance shifted. The lead's authority was being silently questioned, not through rebellion, but through composed resistance and subtle influence. Emily's heart raced, but her demeanor remained serene. She whispered once more, guiding the hesitant hijacker through an invisible path of decision. Pause, observe, think. You have a choice. The young man's hands shook violently, his mind torn between obedience and fear of consequences. The cabin seemed suspended in time. Reynolds, watching from the cockpit, realized that survival depended entirely on the unfolding psychological battle within the cabin, and that Emily had become the pivotal force that could tip the scales. The scuffle ceased. The youngest hijacker's grip loosened further. The lead's face contorted with frustration. Emily's calm influence had created hesitation, doubt, and indecision at a critical moment. Passengers, following her subtle guidance, remained composed, maintaining the fragile balance that had prevented further chaos. The turning point was near. Emily had orchestrated it without aggression, without force, relying solely on strategy, composure, and the subtle art of psychological influence. Outside, the sky remained serene and indifferent, a stark contrast to the tension inside. Inside the cabin, Emily Carter continued her quiet work, her presence a stabilizing force, her guidance a beacon of calm in a storm of fear. The lead hijacker's authority was fracturing, the youngest was hesitant, and the passengers were subtly empowered to maintain control over their own fear. Reynolds understood, with a surge of awe and hope, that the balance of power had shifted. The turning point, the moment that could decide life or death, was within reach, and Emily had orchestrated it with quiet genius. The cabin of Flight 227 was charged with a tension that crackled like electricity. Every breath was deliberate, every movement calculated, every sound magnified in the enclosed metal vessel hurtling through the sky. The youngest hijacker's hesitation had grown, a critical crack that Emily Carter had nurtured with subtle guidance and psychological insight. Passengers, inspired by her calm and deliberate presence, were no longer paralyzed with fear. They had become quietly alert, poised and ready, an unspoken army of composure. The lead hijacker's authority was no longer absolute. The youngest member's doubt had become a weapon Emily could exploit. Emily's eyes scanned the cabin, noting every shift in posture, every glance, every flicker of tension. She whispered to passengers nearest her, voice low but firm, "Stay calm, but be ready. Observe. Watch each movement. Trust yourself. Trust me. We can control our own reactions." She was orchestrating not just a survival strategy, but a psychological counteroffensive. The passengers, inspired by her calm, mirrored her movements, their small acts of controlled resistance subtly undermining the hijacker's dominance. Reynolds, in the cockpit, observed the monitor and felt a surge of cautious hope. The balance had shifted. Control was no longer solely in the hijacker's hands. The youngest hijacker's hands shook visibly, his grip loosening on the small firearm. He glanced repeatedly at Emily, uncertainty etched across his face. Emily recognized the moment for a subtle, silent command. She shifted her body slightly, hands visible but relaxed, projecting unwavering calm and authority. Her gaze met his for a fraction of a second, conveying both acknowledgement and influence. Reynolds watched intently, understanding that this brief interaction could be decisive. The fragile hierarchy among the hijackers was cracking, and Emily had become the unseen catalyst. Emily continued whispering to nearby passengers, giving gentle but precise instructions. Keep low. Move slowly if needed. Follow my lead. Observe, but do not react unless I signal. Each whispered command reinforced composure, subtly guiding behavior without triggering aggression. A young mother clutched her child, breathing in rhythm with Emily. A teenage boy across the aisle mirrored her subtle movements, his fear tempered by her calm authority. The ripple effect of her influence expanded outward, creating pockets of composure that undermined the hijacker's psychological control. The lead hijacker barked another order, frustration evident in his tone. Sit down, now. The youngest hesitated again, glancing at Emily. This hesitation was no longer fleeting. It had begun to shape the dynamics within the cabin. Emily remained seated, calm, her gaze steady, her hands relaxed. She continued to whisper subtle instructions to the passengers around her, reinforcing order, calm, and readiness. Reynolds realized that the moment for action was approaching, and it would be driven by Emily's influence rather than brute force. The stoic third hijacker remained silent, observing but not intervening. Emily understood his role. He would follow the lead or mirror the hesitation of the youngest. She calculated her next move carefully. Timing was everything. Any overt action could provoke violence. Subtle influence could shift the balance without bloodshed. She whispered one final instruction to nearby passengers, ensuring each individual remained poised and composed. Stay steady. Watch them. We can create our own control, carefully and silently. The opportunity is coming. The opportunity presented itself when the lead hijacker momentarily turned away to bark instructions at the rear passengers. The youngest wavered, glancing at Emily once more, uncertainty radiating from him. Emily's subtle cues, a relaxed posture, steady breathing, calm eye contact, nudged him further toward hesitation. Reynolds, observing from the cockpit, adjusted the plane's trajectory slightly, maintaining altitude but preparing for controlled descent toward the nearest emergency landing site. Every movement was deliberate, measured, synchronized with Emily's guidance. Emily's whispered instructions became a lifeline. Slow movements. Eyes calm. Hands visible. Trust yourself. Trust me. We are controlling our own reactions. Passengers absorbed her guidance, instinctively following her lead. The youngest hijacker's indecision became more pronounced, while the lead's frustration escalated visibly. The third hijacker remained a silent observer, unsure how to respond. Emily had created the perfect conditions for regaining control: psychological leverage, passenger readiness, and fractured hijacker authority. Then, with a sudden clarity, Reynolds spoke into the intercom, careful not to alarm the hijackers. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. Flight crew is managing an unusual situation. Follow instructions carefully. His tone was steady, infused with authority. Emily's calm presence amplified the message. Passengers' movements synchronized, breathing slowed, and the tension in the cabin began to shift. The hijackers, sensing resistance but unsure of its source, grew increasingly unsettled. The delicate psychological equilibrium had moved decisively in favor of the passengers' composed defiance. Emily observed the lead hijacker pacing, shouting orders with mounting frustration. The youngest shifted nervously, clearly wavering, and the third remained silent. She recognized the decisive moment approaching. A small, coordinated act could tip the scales completely. She whispered quietly to the passengers nearest her, "On my mark, stay low. Move deliberately. We will act together, carefully." Her voice was calm, unshakable, and each word carried weight. The passengers, inspired by her quiet authority, absorbed every nuance, ready to follow when the time arrived. The lead hijacker swung violently toward a passenger who had flinched, his voice escalating in anger. Emily's eyes locked briefly with the hesitant hijackers, conveying unspoken guidance. Pause, observe, consider, do not act rashly. The young man faltered, weapon lowering slightly, hands trembling visibly. Reynolds realized that Emily's influence had reached its peak. The hijacker's internal balance was fractured, hesitation now dominant over aggression. The plane's safety relied on this crucial psychological tipping point. Passengers, silently directed by Emily, remained poised and observant. The tension was palpable, the slightest sound magnified, yet the cabin's energy had shifted. Fear had not vanished, but calm, coordinated awareness now pulsed like a lifeline through the rows. Emily's whispered guidance, strategic gestures, and unflinching composure had created an invisible framework of control. Reynolds prepared for the descent, his hands steady, his mind synchronized with the silent force shaping the cabin below. The youngest hijacker's indecision reached a breaking point. The lead shouted, frustration boiling over, and the third man looked uncertain. Emily seized the moment, projecting calm authority, reinforcing passenger composure, and maintaining unbroken focus. A quiet command, a gentle nod, a measured shift of body weight, all subtle but potent signals. Reynolds adjusted the autopilot for a controlled descent toward the nearest emergency runway. Every second, every action, every breath brought the turning point closer. As the plane began its gradual descent, the tension in the cabin was almost tangible. Passengers remained frozen in careful positions, eyes alert, movements minimal. The lead hijacker's authority had been fractured. The youngest's hesitation was pronounced, and the third remained passive. Emily continued to whisper, guide, and observe, her presence a stabilizing anchor. Reynolds felt a surge of cautious hope. Flight 227's fate was no longer entirely dictated by fear and violence. Subtle influence, calm authority, and strategic observation had created an opening for control, and Emily was at the center of it. Outside, the sky remained a serene canvas, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Inside, Flight 227 had transformed into a theater of strategy, courage, and psychological mastery. Emily Carter's quiet brilliance had shifted the balance. The passengers' readiness, the hijackers' fractured cohesion, and the pilot's steady hands converged in a delicate dance of survival. Reynolds understood that the next minutes could secure the plane's descent, and Emily's calm influence would guide every step of the journey toward safety. The plane's descent became increasingly tense, every vibration of the engines echoing through the cabin like a heartbeat. The lead hijacker's frustration was now palpable. His aggressive commands rang hollow against the subtle defiance that Emily Carter had cultivated in the passengers. The youngest hijacker's hesitation had grown to near paralysis, and the third remained motionless, uncertain how to act. Emily remained composed, her eyes scanning the cabin, her mind a careful calculation of timing, influence, and opportunity. She knew that every second counted, that the balance of power had shifted, but that danger was still present. "Stay calm," she whispered to the passengers nearest her, her voice steady, precise, and infused with authority. "Stay alert, watch carefully, and follow my lead. Move slowly, deliberately. We are ready." Every whispered instruction reinforced the fragile control she had built, and the passengers obeyed instinctively. Their fear remained, but it was tempered by Emily's calm, deliberate presence. The youngest hijacker's hands shook visibly as he glanced at her again, and for the first time, doubt overshadowed fear of his leader. Captain Reynolds in the cockpit monitored the cabin closely. He had adjusted the plane for a controlled approach to the nearest airport, coordinating with air traffic control for an emergency landing. He realized that the operation's success now depended not just on piloting skill, but on Emily's continued influence in the cabin. The smallest misstep could trigger violence, yet the tiniest act of composure could turn the tide. Reynolds tightened his grip on the yoke, every nerve attuned to the unfolding events below. Emily's plan relied on patience and subtlety. She had created an invisible network of readiness among the passengers, a psychological shield that neutralized panic. She knew that the moment for action had to be precise. The lead hijacker barked another order, slamming his weapon against the seatback. The youngest hesitated, visibly trembling, and Emily's steady gaze met his in an unspoken signal. "Wait, observe, do not act rashly." This silent guidance reached him in the briefest of seconds, a pivotal moment in the unfolding drama. She whispered to a group of passengers, ensuring that everyone near the hijackers understood the plan without words. Hands visible, eyes calm. Move only when I signal. Stay composed. Watch and follow me. Each passenger absorbed her instructions, their collective composure forming a quiet bulwark against the hijacker's aggression. Emily's subtle orchestration had transformed fear into controlled readiness, hesitation into potential action. Reynolds, observing from the cockpit, felt a surge of awe. Emily's quiet leadership had shifted the cabin from a scene of terror to a crucible of strategic calm. The lead hijacker's frustration escalated. He barked, gestured aggressively, and swung his weapon toward a passenger who flinched. But the youngest member froze, weapon lowering slightly, confusion and doubt overtaking obedience. The third hijacker watched silently, unsure whether to intervene. Emily recognized a critical moment. The lead's aggression had created the opening she had been waiting for. Timing was everything. One wrong move, and the situation could escalate catastrophically. One precise, coordinated action, and control could be regained. Emily took a subtle but decisive step. She shifted her posture slightly, signaling calm but deliberate authority. Passengers near the hijackers followed her cues, remaining poised and alert. Emily whispered one final instruction to the hesitant hijacker, her tone gentle but firm. "Pause, observe. You don't have to continue. Think, breathe, choose wisely." The young man's hands trembled. His posture slackened further, and the weight of decision pressed upon him. The lead hijacker, sensing hesitation, turned sharply, but the cabin's composure, guided by Emily, held firm. Then, in a seamless moment of collective awareness, passengers subtly moved in unison. It was almost imperceptible, a shift of posture, a collective stance of readiness. The youngest hijacker faltered completely, his weapon slipping from his grip. The third man hesitated, uncertainty breaking his stoic exterior. The lead, now isolated in his aggression, shouted, swinging his weapon. But the coordinated calm of the passengers and Emily's commanding presence disarmed the psychological control he relied upon. The cabin, once dominated by fear, now radiated quiet, unbroken authority. Captain Reynolds initiated the emergency landing sequence, hands steady on the yoke. Air traffic control cleared the runway, The airport emergency teams prepared, and the aircraft descended steadily. Emily continued whispering calm, reassuring instructions to passengers, guiding their attention, reinforcing composure, and subtly positioning them to reduce risk. The lead hijacker, isolated and panicked, was powerless against the collective readiness Emily had orchestrated. Each passenger remained poised, controlled, and vigilant, their fear transformed into quiet courage. The plane touched down with a smooth, controlled landing. Tires screeched against the tarmac, and the cabin shook slightly. Emergency personnel swarmed the runway as the aircraft rolled to a halt. The lead hijacker, realizing the flight crew had regained control, attempted a desperate move, but the combined calm, coordinated response of passengers, guided by Emily, neutralized the threat. Security teams intervened swiftly, restraining all hijackers with professional efficiency. Relief surged through the cabin as passengers realized the immediate danger had passed. Emily remained seated for a moment, eyes scanning the passengers, ensuring their safety. She whispered soft encouragements, calming frayed nerves, steadying those overwhelmed by adrenaline. Captain Reynolds entered the cabin, eyes wide with awe and gratitude. "You saved them," he said simply, voice trembling. "You saved all of them. I don't know how to thank you." Emily smiled faintly, her demeanor serene despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We did it together," she replied. Everyone stayed calm. "That's what saved us." News crews swarmed the airport within minutes, capturing the story of Flight 227's dramatic ordeal. Passengers recounted Emily's extraordinary composure, her whispered guidance, and her subtle orchestration of calm that had turned a potential disaster into a controlled landing. Authorities praised her presence of mind, her courage under unimaginable pressure, and the psychological acumen that had preserved lives. Emily became a symbol of quiet heroism and reminder that courage is not always loud, that leadership can emerge in the calmest moments, and that human resilience often shines brightest in crises. In the aftermath, passengers embraced, tears of relief streaming down faces that had moments earlier been etched with terror. Families reunited, children clung to parents, and strangers offered heartfelt thanks to Emily, whose calm had preserved life when panic threatened to dominate. Captain Reynolds, interviewed by reporters, described her influence as pivotal. Her calm, her strategy, her courage, it changed everything. Without her, I don't know if we would have made it. Emily remained humble, deflecting praise, emphasizing collective courage and composure. The story of Flight 227 became a national sensation, inspiring articles, interviews, and social media tributes. Experts in crisis management highlighted Emily's methodical approach, her ability to influence behavior under extreme stress, and her unshakable composure. Psychologists analyzed her actions, describing the subtle orchestration of calm as a textbook example of human resilience and strategic intervention in high-stakes situations. Emily, however, remained grounded, quietly absorbing the gratitude, humbled by the lives saved and the composure displayed by the passengers she had guided. In the end, Flight 227's passengers walked away with more than survival. They carried a profound lesson in courage, composure, and human resilience. Emily Carter, the quiet woman in seat 14A, had transformed fear into coordinated calm, hesitation into strategic advantage, and terror into triumph. Her story became a testament to the extraordinary power of one person's calm in shaping outcomes, influencing behavior, and preserving life. The pilot, the passengers, and even the hijackers, whose hesitation had ultimately sealed their defeat, became part of a narrative where courage was quiet, strategy was subtle, and heroism was human. As the sun set over the runway, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Emily walked among the passengers, offering a hand, a reassuring smile, a quiet word of encouragement. She had done more than survive. She had led, saved lives, and shown the world that composure under pressure is the ultimate form of strength. Flight 227 had landed safely, but its story and Emily Carter's heroism would remain in the hearts of everyone aboard for a lifetime.